Hi, Colin.
Hello.
Well, welcome to my evolving podcast on exploring the hard problems of mind and life, where I'm doing deep dives with my friends and people I admire. You happen to be both of those things. So, hey, what's going on? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Semester is over. Just finished lecturing, gave them their exam, so looking forward to the holidays. How about you?
Yeah, me too. I can finally get some writing done.
Um, so tell me about myself. You probably want something for your viewers. As you may have just guessed, I am a professor. I'm a psychologist. I'm a personality psychologist specifically. Um, I'm at the University of Minnesota, and I specialize in trying to understand the structure and sources of personality, which means that I'm interested in understanding what are the most basic and important elements of people's personalities. How do they relate to each other? How do they relate to various outcomes? But perhaps most importantly, and what's most maybe not unique, but unusual in terms of what I do, is trying to understand where they come from in terms of their sources in brain function. So I do a fair amount of neuroscience research trying to understand the neurobiological basis of various personality traits. And I think of personality pretty broadly. So I think of any kinds of psychological individual differences that are reasonably persistent over time are parts of our personality. So I also study things like risk for various kinds of mental health problems, mental disorders, um, issues around intelligence, creativity, problem solving. So it's not just necessarily what people first think of when they think of personality.
How'd you get into this?
The first psychology class that I took when I was an undergrad was a personality course, and I was hooked. It There are a lot of questions that I think a lot of people have, especially when they're about 19, as I was, like about why am I the way that I am? Why are people different from each other? How do I understand my differences from other people? How do I figure out what would be a good path in life that would be suitable for me? And it turns out that personality psychology is an academic field that actually addresses those questions scientifically. So that was kind of a cool thing to discover. And I guess, I'm still interested. I've always been interested in what makes people tick and in the way that the mind works. So
What is
that
a
was
person?
what is a person? Now, do you mean that in the what sense do you mean that in? I mean, organism, right? You're a human organism.
And if you have defining attributes that could be used to characterize you, maybe you'd call that the personality of this organism thing, including us.
Right, right. So personality is basically just anything that is persistent about the way that we behave and experience the world over time. Something that you can use to, pick out one individual rather than another based on their behavior.
What do you think are the most important questions in personality?
Well, I mean, I think I've already implied the the big ones, right? So you've got this person, and things happen to them. So one thing that personality psychology has studied for a long time is if you know things about people and the way that they differ from each other systematically, what can you predict about how their lives are going to go? So you've got this causal chain where the person's in the middle, and or the personality is in the middle, and people's personalities lead them in particular directions. And so one really important question is, where do people's personalities lead them? But another important question is, where do their personalities come from in the first place? And so that's taking the causal chain, in the other direction, back a step. And if we go back, maybe like 2 steps, speaking schematically, we get to people's genetics and then their environmental forces that shape them. And we know from decades of research that both genetics and environments shape people's personalities sort of all throughout life. But regardless of whether it's genetic variation or environmental variation that is causing differences between people, those things both have to have an effect on the brain if that's going to stick. So all of our behavior and our experience is generated by our brains. So I'm interested in that kind of middle step between your distal causes, genes, and your environmental experiences, environmental factors, and then the characteristics that people have, like what's in the middle. Well, the brain's in the middle, and so I'm interested in understanding how the brain works differently in different people to produce their personalities.
So the why, how of personality.
Sure.
Yeah.
The why, how, and where are we going?
In terms of where people can go, how much do people on average, and in terms of how variable their personality is and the degree to which it can change over the life course?
Well, personality definitely can change. Like there was at some point an idea that personality was, well, I think this is kind of a common idea just in the general public, that your personality refers to things that you can't change, that are just always going to be the way that you are. But even these very broad basic personality tendencies, basic personality traits do change over people's lifetimes. Now, they don't often change extremely dramatically. Like people don't usually go from being extreme extroverts to extreme introverts, for example. But they do change over time, and they can change in response to certain types of life experiences. And so for some people, they change more than for others. And so basically what you see is that people's personalities get more and more stable as they get older, up until a point like when they're in their 60s or 70s, and then it starts to destabilize a bit again. And that's probably because, things are starting to go wrong or to degenerate. There's just more of a diversity of kind of outcomes at that point. But, so very small kids are still changing a lot in their personality. Adolescent. So one interesting thing is that personality gets more and more stable over time, but there are also these kinds of persistent, or there are changes that affect most everyone. And so even though when we talk about personality stability, we're just usually talking about how correlated people's personality scores are from one time point to the next time they take a personality test, or 2 years later or whatever. Those get more and more stable, but that masks the fact that especially in adolescence, there are some big changes in personality that don't show up so much as a change in stability, because they happen to most people. They're normative, genetically programmed maturation processes that are linked to puberty and adult development, basically. And so teenagers basically get quite unstable in the sense that they become less conscientious, less agreeable, more neurotic for a few years in there. So like right around 15 is like the nadir of human personality, and any parent of teenagers will know what I'm talking about. But then fortunately they start improving again, and by the time they're in their early 20s, they're usually back up to where they started, or in fact even higher than where they started in terms of their self-regulatory abilities and tendency not to do stupid stuff.
You just mentioned
stupid, annoying stuff.
When people are older, like around 60s or 70s, sometimes the personality will change in like like after the stability, it'll become more flexible again or more plastic.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that you get? Is it just different, or is there any evidence that you might get like a return to like earlier personality modes, like coming back?
That's an interesting question. Like if there's some level of self-regulation that's imposed on top of some base in early adulthood that then might disintegrate in some way, dysfunction, and lead to a return to a previous personality. I don't know if that has been systematically investigated. It's plausible, but it's also plausible just that you get change that is related to, sort of deterioration of brain function in one way or another that isn't like systematically sort of going back down through the developmental layers.
Not quite the Benjamin Button thing that I'm.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
I think I think we just don't know. Both of those things seem like they could happen, but don't know.
So if you were to,
Also, I don't think it's just that you said getting more plastic. I don't think it's just that people are getting more flexible and capable of facile change when they're heading into old age. In fact, if anything, I think they're becoming more rigid and less flexible, less plastic. But at the same time, they're becoming unstable. So stability and plasticity aren't opposite of each other, even though people often think of them that way.
well, on that, if you were to give someone a crash course on cybernetic Big Five theory, just a crash course,
Yeah. All right. So
it might be good for building towards the deeper waters.
Okay.
Or those waters are already deep. So let's try to teach people to swim a bit.
Okay. So cybernetic Big Five theory is what I call my general theory of personality, which is intended basically to be to describe pretty much everything that personality psychologists broadly think of as personality, and then to offer at least the beginning of a kind of a mechanistic, synthetic explanation of all of that stuff. In terms of how does personality function, where does it come from, and so the basic premise of cybernetic Big Five theory, first of all, is that there are two different components of personality. There are two different categories of things that we describe as part of personality. One is personality traits, and that's what we usually think of when we think of, like personality tests or whatever. And that refers to these kinds of broad tendencies that we can use to describe differences between people. And they don't even all have to be broad. They could be as narrow as, your tendency to feel, guilty when somebody else confronts you. It could be narrow, it could be broad, but it refers to things that we can use to describe differences between people in any human culture, anywhere, at any time in human history. So these are differences that are founded in differences in evolved mechanisms that are present in everyone, and therefore that can be used to describe anyone. So, just for example, I'm sure when, our prehistoric ancestors were sitting around in a cave in front of the fire in the evening, that some of them were more argumentative than others. And so, something like how argumentative you are is undoubtedly something that has been useful for distinguishing people from each other forever and always will be. And so those things are personality traits. And then the other category is characteristic adaptations. And that's a kind of a clunky term. I didn't invent it. It's a term that personality psychologists use. And in general, it's been sort of like a grab bag for things that we don't really think of as personality traits, but they still are persistent qualities of a person. And so they are still parts of our personality. So, like if you have a persistent, if you have a persistent love of spaghetti bolognese that, lasts from childhood through adulthood,
How did you know about my terrible longings?
I just guessed. You look like that kind of a guy. Then that's something characteristic. Somebody might say, well, that guy, like, you careful, you go past an Italian restaurant, you're going to lose him. Right? Or if you're if you're a weightlifter, for example, right, and that's something that you do on a regular basis, and you structure your life around making sure that you can get to the gym, and you think about it a lot and whatever. These are things, if you're trying to describe
it's all
something.
means of guilt-free spaghetti. Really, all just funnels back to the spaghetti for me.
Well, and you need the spaghetti because you need the carbs, right?
Yeah. That's what I tell myself.
Carbo loading. Yeah. Anyway, so there are these things about us that can be persistent, and ideas that we have, ways of interpreting the world, beliefs, habits. They're habits of behavior or habits of mind, but they are things that we have learned and developed in reaction to our particular life circumstances. They're not things that would make sense in any culture, right? Because, well, they're cultures that don't lift weights. They're cultures that don't eat spaghetti, right? So it doesn't make sense to try to import those kinds of descriptions into any human culture anywhere. They're limited to certain cultural or even sometimes unique personal contexts. But it's still important to remember that those are part of our persistent characteristics, right? So characteristic just means something that is typical of a person that we can use to describe them, that characterizes them. I sometimes get people who confuse the difference between characteristic and then a discussion of character, like your moral character, right? We use that word in that way, and that's a whole different issue entirely. This is just about, are there differences between people that are due to universal underlying mechanisms that everybody has, but that vary in their intensity and the way in which they function? Or are there differences that are due to specific things that we've learned and have become routine and habitual?
Where would I place moral character or something like that if I wanted
well,
to?
Moral character, you could divide up and find aspects of moral character that are personality traits and others that are characteristic adaptations. And so the degree to which somebody is honest would usually be taken as an example of character, right? And that's a trait, because we can talk about honest or dishonest people in any culture anywhere. But then there are other aspects of moral codes, things that are considered to be the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do that would speak to your character, that are really specific to a given culture. And so those aspects of moral character would be characteristic adaptations.
Two things, I don't know which order to explore, but
well, I could keep talking about CB5T.
Definitely that, but so to put on the list so we don't forget on any order. One would be so you're mentioning a kind of evolutionary vintage of personality traits, and you're saying across humans, but in this cybernetic understanding of personality, in theory, could go back, way before there were ever humans on the scene.
Oh, sure.
And so be interested in more of your thoughts on the general, how general the idea of personality is, and how far back on the tree we can use of evolution we can use which kinds.
Right. I mean, at some level, it's arbitrary because an organism behaves, and there are individual differences in behavior in any species that we know of, and so you could talk about personality in any species. You could talk about it in plants. Now, you might not want to, right? You might decide that we're going to limit, talking about personality to animal species. I mean, the fact that the word person is in there makes it a little awkward, right? Because we're not trying to anthropomorphize, dogs or monkeys or dolphins or whatever it is that we're studying. But they certainly have persistent individual differences in their behavior that over the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge explosion of the study of personality in other species. It's very clear that many of the broad personality traits that we see in people, you can also see in other species. And it's not surprising because a lot of the machinery that we're talking about is evolutionarily ancient. One of my small pet peeves about evolutionary psychology is that it often acts as if everything about people was shaped by, the Pleistocene savanna when the first couple million years of our evolution or whatever in hunter-gatherer groups. But of course, there are a lot of things about us that evolved much farther back than that in previous species, in our older ancestors. So evolutionary biologists talk about the EEA, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, and that is the environment where a particular adaptation, a particular feature of the organism was first shaped, was first appeared, and was shaped by natural selection. And so, many of our functions that we think of in relation to personality, like how sensitive to punishment you are, right? Are you an anxious person, a depressive person, a neurotic person? The basic mechanisms for those kinds of reactions to threatened punishment, we share with all mammals, with even beyond that. So, obviously, and that gets changed and elaborated and complexified in various ways by the time we get to human beings. But a lot of the basic underlying machinery has a lot of continuity way back in the phylogenetic tree. And so, yeah, of course, since we're talking about these things that are evolutionarily ancient, we can see them in other species as well. And I think we're getting to the point where you're starting to see some actually effective crossover, what's called translational research, where research on other species and their individual differences are starting to inform us about ways in which humans work and ways in which the brain works. You see that definitely in research on anxiety, neuroticism, risk for negative tendency to experience negative emotion or to display negative emotion. There's research in primates, other primate species, that has been helpful in learning how the human brain generates anxiety and distress, and reasons why that might be dysfunctional in some people who suffer from mood disorders or anxiety problems.
One of the things I really like about the cybernetic perspective on personality that you describe is, like, I want to go, like, I'm very fine with plant personalities. And I think that's even like leaving, in terms of like this translational work you're talking about, like it's leaving some good hypotheses / explanations on the table if we don't go there. Like you sent me this one paper a bit ago on like serotonergic signaling in plants and things like phototaxis, where like, there's a 1A receptors, it's actually like stabilizing the cytoskeleton. But then like the 2A receptors, the plant is actually facilitating like literal, like physical plasticity,
right,
as you make the membrane more, as you make the cytoskeleton more fluid. So the question, like I'd wonder, is like, to what extent are some of, like, although you would expect these things to maybe, take a long and winding road, in some ways they might not, like a common cybernetic significance of some of these mechanisms going all the way back to, hundreds of millions, maybe billions of years, but some of them even maybe the dawn of life.
Yeah, it's remarkable, the parallels. If we sit at a appropriate level of abstraction, right? Because I think there's a real risk there in drawing a direct analogy between, like, what serotonin is doing in a plant and what it's doing in a person. And obviously, evolution is constantly repurposing older features and functions to do new things. But at the same time, there's this kind of a path dependency issue where if the system is built in such a way that one particular molecule, like serotonin, is doing a particular kind of thing functionally, it would be very hard to completely change what it's doing at the level of function without destabilizing the system so badly that it's just going to fail. And so I think there is a tendency for evolution to, maintain function at least at a sufficient level of abstraction. And it does seem like serotonin is prone to stabilizing systems in terms of keeping them on track in their cybernetic function and causing them to resist disruption from outside influences. And you see that at all different scales, and even potentially, as you pointed out, in terms of the kind of physical structure of plants. So yeah, very interesting questions, and I guess leading us back into stability and plasticity and CB5T. So I guess the best place to go from there is to why it's called Cybernetic Big Five Theory. And that's because the Big Five are five major dimensions of personality variation. Like if you have just many different descriptions of the ways that people vary all kinds of different personality traits, and you measure them all in a large enough group of people, you have a sufficiently representative sampling of descriptions, and then you factor analyze them, what you'll find is that you get something resembling these five big factors. And a factor is basically just a description of the tendency for certain traits to appear together within individuals. So it might be mysterious why it is that people who are more likely to talk a lot are also more likely to experience positive emotions, to be more socially assertive, also to be more friendly and outgoing. But they are, and that's one of the things that the Big Five represents, and that specifically what I was just describing is the dimension of extraversion. And so for a long time, personality psychologists were really focused on this question of what are the major dimensions of personality? How do we get this down to a kind of tractable and reasonably consensus-based set of things to study in people's personality? And that led to the Big Five were first discovered all the way back in the 40s or 50s. They didn't really get solidified until we had better computing power to handle larger data sets and larger numbers of variables. And that happened in the 70s and 80s. And that led to the discovery of the Big Five. But then you get to the question that I'm interested in, which is, so where do those traits come from? Why do all those things go together? And that's where this idea of evolved mechanisms with variation comes in. And so, for example, for extroversion, we can think about the mechanisms that govern our sensitivity to the possibilities of reward. Like, do we get eagerly motivated to pursue something if we sense a possibility that could potentially be rewarding to us? Do we experience a lot of pleasure and enjoyment when we get something that is, the fulfillment of one of our goals? Those are the mechanisms that seem to underlie extroversion, and they explain why that whole set of traits tend to go together in the same people.
You've also done work in terms of the more complex structure of the Big Five, its hierarchical structure.
Right. Yeah, so the Big Five are the ones that people know now because they've achieved this kind of consensus status in personality psychology. I mean, which is not to say that consensus is perfect, of course. There are people who favor a six-factor model instead.
The HEXACO.
Yeah, that's one of the ways.
But largely similar, though, isn't it?
Yeah, very similar. I mean, three of the dimensions are almost exactly the same across the two models, and then the extra one is they're just like they're slightly shifted, but you can see basically you can take any personality trait almost and categorize it within either one of those systems. So they're not radically different. So it's one of these cases of academics will argue viciously about very small differences that may not matter that much in terms of our broader understanding. But yeah, so I just wanted to caveat for any HEXACO fans out there that I'm not trying to ignore the debates, but the big five. And I think there are theoretical and empirical reasons why you might prefer the big five over the big six, but these are kind of, esoteric, technical, scientific debates. They're very similar. But anyway, the thing that you're getting at is the fact that personality traits are hierarchically structured, right? And that means that you can describe broad personality traits, but you can also break them down into narrower personality traits. And I've already provided some examples for that in relation to extroversion. We could talk about how much, positive emotion and joy and enthusiasm someone experiences. We can talk about how sociable they are. We can talk about how much they seek out exciting experiences, exciting situations. We can talk about how assertive and forceful they are. We can talk about whether they're likely to be leaders and dominant in whatever particular social context they're in. All these things are different facets of extroversion. And to say that somebody is high in extroversion tells you that on average they tend to be high on those lower level traits, but it doesn't tell you the exact level of their lower level traits. And in fact, they could be high on a number of them, but even low on one or two, and still have a pretty high score on extroversion. Right? You might get somebody who looks in general very extroverted, but doesn't actually experience a lot of sort of ebullient positive emotion. And that doesn't mean that they're not, that doesn't mean that their extroversion score is somehow inaccurate. It just means that their extroversion is constituted in a way that's slightly different from somebody else's, who might be very extroverted in a whole bunch of other ways, including experiencing a lot of joy and excitement, but isn't particularly assertive socially, let's say.
They could be very assertive, but not necessarily very enthusiastic about what's happening.
Yeah,
or vice versa. You can,
or vice versa.
It's awesome, but then you're not going out and getting particular ends. Yeah.
Right, and so people, I think, because it would be easiest if everything was just monolithic, like people, when you say extroversion, they want it to mean one thing. But it doesn't mean one thing, because personality traits are probabilistic. That's probably the most important thing to know for lay people who are interested in personality. If you're trying to understand what personality is that these descriptions are probabilistic. If I say somebody's extroverted, it doesn't mean that they're going to be acting highly extroverted in every situation all of the time. Well, first of all, there's some situations where there aren't particularly good cues for extroversion. People who are, when you're alone in your house, you're probably not talking as much. You wouldn't see so much variation in that kind of talkativeness piece of extroversion. Although I bet extroverts are more likely to talk to themselves than introverts are. So even there you can see differences. And there's interesting research that shows that even when they're by themselves, extroverts experience more kind of high arousal, positive emotions than introverts do. So it's not like the trait goes away, but there are some limitations on how it might be expressed. And there's kind of a distribution in the way that we behave over time. And basically, what a personality trait says is that on average, you tend to act more this way than somebody who has a different level of the personality trait. So extroverts act more extroverted on average than introverts, but it doesn't mean that they're acting extroverted all the time. And it doesn't mean that they can't act introverted sometime. And it doesn't mean that, occasionally in some situations, an introvert might, for whatever reason, act more extroverted than the extrovert does. But it's just a question of probability. And that works in terms of this hierarchical arrangement as well, because if you say somebody's high in extroversion, it means that they are more likely to have these average tendencies to act extroverted across all these different specific facets of extroversion as well, these narrower traits. But it doesn't say exactly which traits, and it doesn't mean that everybody who's at the same level has the same lower level pattern of more specific traits.
That's interesting, the extroversion on your own. I keep thinking about you wouldn't expect there to be an opportunity for you to manifest extroverted traits in the normal ways when you're on your own, but then there's a sense in, to what extent are we ever really on our own? We're always simulating other people's different social encounters, or even this is a little weird, but the way we might relate to ourselves as a kind of quasi-social interaction.
Right, and as I said, I would bet that extroverts are more likely to talk to themselves than introverts are, out loud anyway. I mean, I don't mean mental communication, but actually speaking out loud while you're by yourself, or singing. I bet extroverts are more likely to sing in the shower and to sing to themselves when they're by themselves. So this kind of expressive behavior, and also physical activity, because that's something that goes along with extroversion. Extroversion is associated with higher levels of energy and physical activity. And so I bet when they're by themselves, extroverts are more likely to be active in various ways. And as I said, we know that they're more likely to experience positive emotions even when they're by themselves. So, they're all. Anxiety is another good one, right? You can be anxious with other people, you can be anxious by yourself. But if we say somebody is high in anxiety, we don't mean that they're experiencing intense anxiety, or even any anxiety at every minute of the day. We just mean that they're more likely to be more anxious in more situations than somebody who's low in anxiety.
Probability distributions of traits. And so these distributions could overlap heavily.
Yeah.
But,
and they do, I'm not going to interrupt by throwing up diagrams, but you can see there's actually nice empirical research. Will Fleeson did a lot of this pioneering research to show that if you assess people's behavior over time, like you ping them at random times throughout the day over the course of a week and ask them what they've been doing and what they've been feeling like over the last half hour or hour.
Like experience sampling?
It's called experience sampling, yep. Or ecological assessment, or there are various different labels for it. Ecological momentary assessment. You get a distribution, right? You get something sort of bell curve shaped because sometimes the people are acting, really, really extroverted. Sometimes they're acting introverted. So most of the time they're somewhere in between. But the average of that distribution is very stable over time. Like you do it for a week, and then a month later you do it for another week. You'll get a very strong correlation between people's averages, even though obviously any specific instance of behavior can be anywhere in that distribution and bounces around depending on how people's mood and their situation and their goals at that particular moment. But yeah, so there are these probabilistic distributions of our behavior and our experience, and the average of those distributions corresponds quite well, like surprisingly well, to the measurements that we get when we just ask people how they typically behave on questionnaires, the standard personality questionnaire. It's kind of interesting that that's sort of like the foundational assumption for all of standard personality assessment. And yet it wasn't actually demonstrated empirically until just the last 20 years. Personality assessment goes back to Francis Galton. He basically invented the personality questionnaire. One of Darwin's cousin, another genius in the late 20th century. But that foundational assumption that if you ask people how they are in general, that it will actually reflect their average tendencies, that has not been really well demonstrated until just recently. But it does seem to be true, so that's good for the field. It means that our basic assumptions about measurement weren't completely off. So the hierarchy, right? So you've got narrower traits, you've got broader traits, and a bunch of my research that hasn't been focused on neuroscience has been focused on trying to understand the structure of that hierarchy. And so one of the issues with these facet level traits is that it's hard to figure out exactly how many there should be. It's possible that there are as many as you can make a clear distinction between and that actually are useful for then predicting differences in people's behavior. But at some point, there starts to be some kind of empirically identifiable structure. And it turns out that for each of the big five, you can break them down into two major subdimensions of personality. So we've been talking about extroversion, and I foreshadowed this point. You can break extroversion down into assertiveness and enthusiasm, and then those themselves could be subdivided into narrower traits at an even lower level. So enthusiasm can be broken down into positive emotionality and sociability or gregariousness. Assertiveness, you can think about pushiness or leadership abilities. You can break them down, but you can also put them together. And sometimes when you're studying, depending on what you're thinking about or what you're studying, you want to be at a different level of the personality hierarchy because a different specificity of trait will be relevant to a different feature, a different outcome, a different brain function, whatever. So there's that middle level where each of the big five has two different aspects. And then I've also shown that well, I wasn't the first one to discover this. Jack Digman was a personality psychologist who's one of the really influential people who helped to provide the evidence for the Big Five. But he discovered that the Big Five have a higher order factor solution. So the Big Five were originally assumed to be orthogonal, just independent of each other, and the highest possible level of personality description. But partly that was because of a particular analytic choice. Like when you create a factor analysis, you have to decide whether your factors mathematically are going to be forced to be independent of each other or whether they're going to be allowed to be correlated. And for a couple of different reasons, most of the early research that led to the Big Five forced them to be independent of each other. So obviously, if they were in reality correlated, you couldn't tell that from those analyses because they were forced to be orthogonal. But what people noticed after they created measures of the Big Five and started using them a lot was that they do tend to have regular patterns of correlation among them. And those patterns of correlation actually reveal a higher order factor structure, such that there are two higher order factors that themselves appear to be uncorrelated. There's debate about that, but if you look at, because if you just take a single person or single people's ratings of themselves, they will tend to be correlated, but that appears to be an artifact of certain things about the way in which people are biased when they assess their own personalities. Lots of weeds we could run off into here and get tangled up in, but the long story short is just that there appears to be this very broad set of factors that are even broader than the Big Five. And I suggested labeling those as stability and plasticity. And stability refers to the fact that high conscientiousness, high agreeableness, and low neuroticism tend to go together in people. And then plasticity refers to the fact that high extraversion and high openness intellect appear to go together. We haven't stopped and given like a primer on the Big Five yet, and I don't know if we need to do that, but I'll just say a little bit about that last one, openness/intellect. That's probably that's been the most contentious and confusing and complicated of the Big Five factors. And that's because it combines this kind of general, well, I think the easiest way to think about the factor as a whole is that it represents variation in our tendency to explore the world cognitively rather than behaviorally. Like extroversion is more related to behavioral exploration, right? Do you go out and you talk to that person and that person? Do you run around that corner and see what's there? But openness and intellect refer to our ability to see patterns in things, sort things out, think about things, figure out the world through cognition. And the openness to experience side of that is more about how we relate to the world through perception and our senses, and like, do we see patterns in things? Are we interested in aesthetics? Does art appeal to us? Are we likely to make it? Do we tend to fantasize about things? In other words, do we use like the whole machinery of our perception, including imagining perception, in order to understand the world and identify patterns in it? Whereas the intellect side of things is more about our use of logic and reasoning to understand the world and to create conceptual models about what are the causal relations among things and what are the logical relations among things. And that's a pretty wide field, right? The human capacity for cognitive exploration is probably the thing that is most characteristic of us as a species. And so it's a very broad personality trait, openness/intellect. It's hard to come up with a single label that works for it. People have suggested imagination because that's very central to both, like, coming up with new ideas, but also, fantasizing and imagining perceptual experiences that you've never actually had. So could call it imagination, could call it creativity, because there's both intellectual creativity and artistic and aesthetic creativity. But whatever, in the openness is the label that sticks. But really, openness to experience only describes half of that broad personality dimension, because the intellectual component is really important as well. And you can have people who are high in openness to experience, but not high in intellect, right? Like the classic example of that would be some like, sort of new age hippie type who's very open to all kinds of ideas and interested in all kinds of things, but doesn't necessarily have a very rigorous analytic ability to say which of those things are plausible and which aren't, which of those things really fit together coherently and logically, and which don't. And then you can also get people who are, very intellectual, but just have zero imagination, like zero I mean, they might be imaginative in the sense that they come up with some new ideas once in a while, but they have no sense of, attention to the perceptual details of the world, or interest in art, or openness to the meaning of different, like emotional experiences. So very broad.
I wish we called it imagination or creativity, but that's
innovation.
That's just like what would be, because they're very different. Like either just being open to different experiences and this seeking out of the new, but it could be of a very uncritical variety, or like taking things analytically apart and trying to like find the pattern within them. And like the idea that like, okay, well, now what's common, and then we're thinking of a common capacity for imagination, or what would both these things potentially enable, something like creative capacity.
Like innovation. But like, I mean, technically what I think that they enable is for us to create models of the world, cognitive models of the world, right? They're what allow us to identify regularities in the structure of our experience and our interpretations of what's going on and what exists. And the openness to experience side has to do with detecting correlational patterns, like what things tend to go with what in our perception. It can be in ideas too, but it's like really founded in the fact that we model the world in terms of what things we expect to appear with each other. Whereas intellect is about modeling the causal structure of the world. So they're both about generating interpretations of the world around us that we can then use to compare to what we would like the world to be, or what we expect the world to be.
And in theory, synergistic, like not like so that they can be opposing in some people, or
but on average they tend to go together, which is interesting because the profile of risk for psychosis is basically high openness and low intellect, right? So if you're high in openness but you're not that smart, then that's a risk factor for, psychosis describes basically an extreme lack of touch with reality, or a lot of errors in our models of the world, right? So hallucinations and delusions are the basis of psychosis. Those are the fundamental criteria for saying that psychosis is present. And you can see, hallucination is basically like inaccuracies in our perceptual models. Delusions are inaccuracies in our belief models. So, you've sort of got all of that expressed there. And so, you can, like if you have high openness and low, it's like basically you're taking in a huge amount of information, but you don't have the ability to sort through it well. That's a risk for then creating models that don't work, that don't really reflect what's out there. But and people have wondered why does risk for psychosis persist in populations? Because it's demonstrably bad for fitness, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, people who have problems with psychosis have fewer offspring. So if it's really that dangerous and disabling, why does it persist over time? And the probable answer to that is that because it's tied into the evolution of some of these extremely sort of flexible and complex cognitive capacities that we have. So the ability to be creative and cognitively flexible. So that evolves, and then the risk for that to go wrong evolves as well. And that is basically the risk for psychosis.
Do you think there could be also, in addition to that, like life histories, strategies that were specifically selected that also flirted with what might be a psychosis prone regime, but maybe in a different context didn't manifest it, like shaman casts, like I've heard, like, or classes, like I was reading recently, like in some the psychedelic literature about like the shaman like having like 15 children. It's like that's doing pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that Daniel Nettle, I don't know if he was the first person to propose that, but he's written about that and studied it. So there, artistic creativity is sexually attractive, right? So artists and musicians tend to have more sexual partners than similar people who happen not to be creative. So creativity is something that might, as you say, lead to, it might be it might be a niche, and it might come with more risks for certain kinds of dysfunction. But if it pays off often enough, those characteristics will then, those traits will persist in the population. So we were almost to stability and plasticity.
Almost there. But before we get there, curious, or maybe after we get there, with the HEXACO, how similar is the aspect level, and how similar will the meta traits, like how would we think of the meta traits with the big six?
Well, I mean, it's pretty straightforward if you just map them onto the big five, because there's a lot of research showing that so the honesty humility dimension is the one that is claimed as the sixth dimension that's supposed to be separate from the big five. But there's a lot of research showing that honesty and humility is just part of agreeableness within the big five. I mean, you can separate them, and sometimes it's very useful to, but you can also just model those traits as facets of a broader agreeableness dimension in the big five. And agreeableness basically reflects a combination of all of the traits that reflect variation tendencies to be cooperative and altruistic versus not, right? Versus being, selfish and exploitative. And because there's no, like, we're social creatures, you have to have some degree of cooperation with other people in order to function, but there's nothing that indicates exactly what the optimal amount of cooperation is, right, from an evolutionary perspective. So some people might thrive by taking advantage of other people, whereas other people might thrive by being hyper cooperative with other people.
Different life history strategies.
Different life history strategies, different environmental affordances. In some environments, it's going to pay off more to be cooperative. In others, it's going to pay off more to be exploitative. Agreeableness in the big five refers to basically all of the things that are part of that spectrum. Different kinds of altruism, different kinds of cooperation.
So it's most closely related to moral character.
Yeah, oh, absolutely, and especially that honesty and humility dimension that
especially when framed that way.
In HEXACO, yeah, when you frame it as honesty and humility, that sort of gets at the core of a lot of what we think of as moral character. Although we also think about moral character in terms of things like courage and bravery and leadership and open-mindedness and curiosity. So you can identify things that have moral valence assigned to them in any of the big five. Because again, like virtue and moral value, that's an interpretation that is laid on top of these functional qualities. And so, like, it is impossible to argue, although many philosophers have, of course, that what we consider to be moral virtues are always advantageous to the individual, because they're, from an evolutionary perspective, that's obviously not true. And it's not even clear that it's true just in terms of the fulfillment of the person's individual goals. So, like, it's easier to set those kinds of moral philosophy questions aside when you're thinking about the sources and the nature of personality. I mean, we can talk about them a lot if you're interested, but it's sort of like it's useful to bracket that as a topic with some very specific additional constraints.
I will want to come back around to that when we discuss your work on well-being and on concepts of integration with respect to personality. So, but
maybe we'll do that on another day.
Yeah, I will want to loop around back to that though.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. We can definitely do that. But Oh, right, HEXACO and the meta traits. So stability and plasticity, these higher order factors are often labeled. Digman first labeled them as meta traits, just because they're so.
He called them alpha and beta.
Yeah, he called them alpha and beta because he didn't want to commit to a particular interpretation of them. He thought they might be linked to like socialization for alpha or stability, and personal growth for plasticity or beta. But socialization and personal growth, those are sort of more like outcomes of psychological processes rather than a description of the underlying functions. And so that was why we came up with these labels of stability and plasticity, to try to get at what are these functional properties that are varying within the systems that are people. And so in HEXACO, basically it would just be the same, except that honesty and humility is kind of tacked on. There are various subtle differences. If you actually look at the measurement system for HEXACO, one of the things that they did was that they designed it to try to create maximum independence of the 6 different factors.
So more ICA-like and less PCA, or more independent components, or?
Well, more orthogonal rather than oblique rotation, if you want to get technical about it. More simple structure. So, but we know that personality doesn't have simple structure, so you can try to impose simple structure on it, but that's artificial, and maybe it's useful for certain reasons, but it's not necessarily the best descriptor of, or the best description of what's out there. So anyway, again, lots of weeds of psychometric argument there. But at any rate, like, there are these 2 higher order factors. They don't appear to be just an artifact. They have genetic contributions to their existence. And they correspond to these 2 absolutely fundamental principles for any cybernetic system. So cybernetics is the study of goal-directed systems that self-regulate via feedback. In other words, they're able to compare where they want to be to where they are, and make adjustments to their behavior, deploy various operators or strategies based on a mismatch to try to close that gap. Right. So a goal is basically just a state of the system that the system attempts to move toward using various feedback processes and various operators that allow it to change its own state and the state of the world. And that's what people are. That's what organisms are. They're cybernetic systems. And so that forms the sort of the basic principles, obviously, that underlying my cybernetic theory of personality. And then the stability and plasticity describe these 2 properties that are necessary for any kind of cybernetic system that's going to be able to adapt flexibly to changing conditions. And not just adapt in terms of, like, any cybernetic system, like a thermostat. If it's too hot, it'll make it colder. If it's too cold, it'll make it hotter. So that's not the kind of adaptation I'm talking about, because it always has exactly the same goals. It has, the goal is just whatever you set the temperature to. And so, like, a thermostat can't do anything other than regulate temperature. And it can't, and on the measurement side, in terms of modeling what the current state of the world is like, it can't do anything other than register with a thermometer what the temperature is. And then in terms of its operators, it can't do anything other than, like, turn on the furnace or turn on the air conditioning. So every cybernetic system has to have minimally those 3 elements. It has to have some goal state that's represented in some way physically in the system. Has to have a representation of the current state in relation to that goal so that they can be compared through a feedback process. And then it has to have some operator or set of operators that can actually be turned on or off, engaged to change the world, change the system in order to reduce that gap between the goal and the present. And so what I mean by being able to adapt to a complex or changing environment is one in which the system can actually potentially generate new goals or new operators or new sort of categories for modeling what the current state of the world is. And people can obviously do that. And that's exactly what characteristic adaptations are, right? They're the various specific concrete goals or interpretations or strategies that we learn from interacting with the world and that then we can deploy to try to achieve our goals. And so any system that is going to adapt to complex or changing environments over time has to be able to take in new information and to adjust its representations and strategies accordingly. And that's plasticity fundamentally, right? But even more than that, it has to just be able to carry out the goal-directed functioning in the first place. And so any cybernetic system has to maintain a stability of functioning. Like if your thermostat doesn't keep the temperature within a certain range effectively, then you say, well, it's broken, it no longer works. Well, similarly, if an organism can't pursue its goals effectively in such a way that allows it to actually achieve those goals and to get the nutrition that it wants and whatever else it wants, well, then it's not functioning well as a cybernetic system. So
I could see this like harmonizing nicely with Digman's if you're really focusing on us as a social animal. And if you're really focusing on our intersubjective social primary niche, then you're like, okay, but what you're doing though with taking these meta traits and interpreting them as stability and plasticity is you're getting at the fundamental cybernetic significance that would apply not just for basically any complex adaptive goal-seeking system would have to be facing this potential trade-off and synergy of these two control parameters, which, as you call it, exist in the state of dynamic tension. And so in the particular context of us as like the social animal, then Digman's makes a good amount of sense, like that interpretation. But
right, and like I said, but it's more of an outcome, because he was saying like, well, what is it, when you see humans who are more conscientious and reliable and more agreeable and able to get along with other people effectively and maintain social harmony, and they've got better control of their negative emotions and they're not like blowing up and flying off the handle and getting upset. Like, what do we call that? Well, those people are well socialized, right? They've got good self-regulatory capacities. They can interact well with, the demands of society and other people. So, I mean, that is a major consequence of having high levels of stability as a human individual, and certainly like the socialization process whereby you over time you become capable of better self-regulation, right? Like, I mean, what characterizes the kind of unruly teens that we were talking about earlier? It's like they're not well socialized yet, right? They're not able to conform to social norms. Like not like conforming to social norms is always like what we
which
what
might
we want.
potentially be important because they don't know what their characteristic adaptation should be yet, and they're
they're learning they have to learn a whole suite of
you need to keep it open-ended,
how to be an adult human.
Right? You're not going to be particularly plastic if you completely disregard norms, but if you are overly slavish to them, then that will interfere with your capacity to reconfigure yourself, generate new strategies and new goals. Like,
yes, right. I mean, so you're getting back to this kind of dynamic tension idea. But I feel like, I kind of feel like we're now diving into like some of these details about stability and plasticity with maybe not quite enough introduction to them.
You might be right.
Yeah. So let me back up a couple of steps and say, okay, so stability, basically that's what is shared among conscientiousness, agreeableness, and low neuroticism. And so you can think of that as like low neuroticism is emotional stability. It's often labeled that way in personality psychology, actually. High conscientiousness, that's basically like motivational stability, the ability to ignore distractions, stay on track with your goal pursuit, pursue longer term goals effectively, maintain order, self-discipline. And then agreeableness is like social stability, right? It's like, can you maintain the stability of your social relations, maintain social harmony, be sufficiently cooperative with people that you're not constantly running into conflict in that way. And then on the plasticity side, you've got extraversion that's more about behavioral kinds of exploration, and openness and intellect that's more about cognitive exploration. And so you want to maintain enough stability so that you can pursue your goals effectively, but you also want to maintain enough flexibility, exploratory capacity, so that you can deal with novelty and so that you can expand your behavioral and interpretive repertoire so that you can, have more competencies in more situations. And different people just differ in their basic tendencies toward those things. And that's partly because, as you were just alluding to, there are interesting trade-offs, right? Like in a kind of idealization of the way that the system works, you would want like maximum stability and maximum plasticity, right? Because that means that you are going to remain coherently able to pursue your goals effectively, to pursue your basic needs effectively, but you're also going to be maximally able to explore and develop new competencies and take in novel information when it arises, or seek it out because it might be might provide good opportunities. So that would be like kind of some ideal, but in reality, there's a dynamic tension between them because it's not so simple. Because the more you explore, the more you expose yourself to novelty and to new information and try to integrate it, the more you're likely to destabilize your existing structure. You can be overwhelmed by new situations, by new information. It can become impossible to figure out like what to do or what to think. And so like too much plasticity makes it hard to maintain stability. But over time, of course, too little plasticity also makes it hard to maintain stability, because if you're not adapting, you're not changing, you're not willing to consider new things or to do new things, to step outside your comfort zone at all, then, well, actually that can work just fine if your environment is incredibly predictable and stable over time. Right? But that just makes you basically like a slave to the predictability of your environment. And once your environment starts changing, something happens that disrupts you. If you don't have that plasticity, it's going to be very hard to adapt. And then you're going to end up being destabilized. Like no matter how stable you were in a very predictable environment, if you don't have the ability to adapt and be plastic, when you get into a less predictable environment, you're in trouble.
So while there's that like complementarity and potential for synergy, the tension part, is that part of a like theoretical reason? So like just empirically in terms of methods, you would say that something like an even higher level of personality, like a global factor personality, is largely artifactual. But is the tension part the theoretical reason why we might not expect to observe that, or would that be a different issue?
Yes, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, so going back to this question of artifact, I'm just going to shut a blind here because the sun's starting to get in my face. So if we look at self-ratings of personality, or if we get like somebody's peers to rate them, as long as we're only looking at one rater per person, we do see a correlation between stability and plasticity. And when I initially saw that, I thought, oh, cool, that's an indication of the fact that these things are complementary and they support each other, right? Like you have to have a certain amount of sense of security and stability in order to be willing to explore. In order to be stable over time in a changing environment, you have to be plastic and adaptive and exploratory. But then it turns out that if you actually measure personality by using not just self-ratings, but also peer ratings, if you combine multiple people's ratings of the same people into a single measurement, like you rate my personality, I rate my personality, another friend rates my personality. Now we've got three different perspectives on what my personality is like. If we combine all of those and then we look at the correlation, then we see it's basically zero. So then the higher order factors still remain. It's still the case that even like all these different people agree that people who are more extroverted also tend to be higher in openness and intellect. They agree that people who are more conscientious tend to be less neurotic, more agreeable. But they don't agree that there's any correlation between those two things. And so what that seems to be doing, basically, like we know that there's bias in people's personality ratings because, the major one is called evaluative consistency bias. So if you say that somebody has some desirable qualities, you tend to say that they have, all the desirable qualities, at least to some extent, right? If you like somebody, basically you shift all of their personality traits in a slightly more positive direction than you should. And if you dislike them, you shift it in the negative direction. That goes for the self too. Like if you find this with people who have low self-esteem or are depressed, they will tend to rate themselves consistently worse than they should across the board in terms of their personality traits. question.
I guess I was wondering, so ideally we would crank them as much as we could until the dissonance sets in between stability and plasticity. I guess partly I'm wondering is like if we.
Well, like it's an optimization problem with no perfect answer, right?
Because it's a fundamental tree, yeah.
If you become perfectly stable, obviously you have no room for plasticity.
It's faced by every neural net and every dynamical system.
Yeah, exactly. It's the stability plasticity trade-off. I actually took those terms from the work of Stephen Grossberg, who was one of
adaptive
the
resonance theory guy.
Yeah, one of the pioneers of neural network modeling, right? And in these very early neural network models, what he realized was that you have to basically have a quasi-independent, a conditionally independent subsystem within the learning system that can handle sufficient, if the information is sufficiently novel, sufficiently outside of the existing learned categorization scheme, you need some kind of system that can metabolize it slowly enough and kind of feed it into the system so that it doesn't destabilize the whole thing.
Without the catastrophic forgetting problem.
Yeah, or catastrophic mushing together. I'll tell you the example that I always like that I use in my undergrad classes is that there's this story about an early neural network that was trained to identify birds and fish, right? So you feed it a bunch of characteristics of this particular organism, and then it learns to tell you based on those characteristics whether it's a bird or a fish. And so, like you go through, you do this a lot. You feed it many different birds, many different fish. Pretty soon, it's really good at saying this is a bird, this is a fish. This is a bird, this is a fish. It can tell them apart. But then you give it a penguin, and it basically just blows up. Like the categorization system blows up. But it blows up in a way, interestingly, where it's not just forgetting, but where now it says that all birds are birds and fish, and all fish are birds and fish. And it sort of just mashed them together because it's like you had this exemplar that was so far outside of the norm for the categories and had so many features of both categories that it is now, just it no longer can make that distinction. So like you could get catastrophic forgetting, or you could get catastrophic remembering, mushing.
I guess in terms of the question, I'm wondering that if, let's say we had some society where people in general were flourishing more and where like the alignment between like how well we knew each other was like less subject to these biases, but it was more we're on the same page. I mean, I could see, it's good that people have different perspectives, but also it's potentially a little bit troubling if like your self perspective is radically different from those around you. To me, that's like showing something's not quite going right here. So I guess one thing I'm wondering is like, could there be like an imagined world where there would be a higher order structure, and these, like, you might say that like this world has persons with more like integration, like they're more person-like, like they're better at personing?
No, I reject your premise of person-likeness.
Because you were large, you could say multitudes. No, go on.
Right. But I mean, yeah.
More agentic, at least, or more effectively agentic. Like
more effective at pursuing their goals, certainly, right? And most of the strategies that we give people to try to help them to get what they need and to function well in life are either ways to help them be more stable or to help them be more flexible. Right? Those are, that's the basic dynamic. And like if you look at
SSRI or a psychedelic, take your pick.
Yeah, right. Well, interestingly, both operating on the serotonergic system. Yeah, right. And so are psychedelics increasing exploration primarily, or are they just destabilizing in a way that then opens the gate basically for exploration? Talk to somebody.
Plant article was suggesting that the one plant article you sent me was kind of suggesting at a low level this opponency of the 1A and the 2A receptors, and like you're talking about like their different affinity. So it's like there's like this challenge, and so serotonin start to rise in the face of challenge, and then your initial response is, okay, stay the course,
right. Steady as she goes.
Yeah, steady as she goes. But then like it's really no, we got to pivot. This is not working.
Abandoned ship.
Yeah, now the two A's
Yeah.
with their higher affinity
All
start
right.
to go
We're gonna
online. Yeah,
keep up the nautical metaphors.
yeah, like good cyberneticians. Yeah,
Yeah. All right. The steersman. Um, yeah. I mean, should we have a brief historical digression? Cyberneticus, right, is the good steersman. That's where cybernetics comes from. Is it? You stuck that quote into our chapter, right? Is it?
yeah.
Is it Aristotle? No, it was
Plato.
Plato. Yeah.
Yeah,
So right, and the idea is that you're steering a course, and cybernetics comes from the Greek word for steering a ship, basically.
or governance too.
Yeah, governance, steering the ship of state. Everybody loves nautical metaphors. Um, all right, and that's well, anyway, that's probably because you are a cybernetic system in deep water. That's the human condition, right? If if it breaks down, it goes down.
And where there is known and there is unknown territory that we're trying to navigate our way through.
Right. Well, and that when you're out on the water, the known territory is this thing that you have constructed, and that's right. We've constructed the society that protects us. We as individuals construct our skills and our knowledge base, our knowledge systems that protect us. And without them, we're dead. Without them, we are just drowning in the ocean of the unknown.
And the most probable thing happens and we become mush.
Yes, right. Mush or bits.
Yeah.
Probably more bits than mush. Bits of mush. Anyway, yeah.
We covered some good ground today, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'd like to keep going into deeper waters.
We can we can do another half hour or so if you want.
I could do 15 minutes.
Okay. I mean, we can stop whenever you want. It's your podcast.
No, but let's keep going.
Okay. Well, then where are? Oh, right. We're talking about why there isn't a general factor of personality. Well, so here's the thing. Like, you can find the reason that there's not a general factor of personality is that once you get up to stability and plasticity, any combination becomes equally likely in terms of what you actually observe. Now, we can say just in terms of what personality traits are correlated with, that absolutely it is true that in general, the best outcomes are associated with higher levels of stability and higher levels of plasticity. But you can find equally many people who have high plasticity and high stability, high plasticity and low stability, low both, or high stability and low plasticity. And we can characterize those four quadrants in various interesting ways in terms of what those things predict. And in fact, one of the things I wrote about as long ago as in my dissertation when I was in grad school was the way in which that is kind of parallel to the four quadrants of the ancient Greek and Roman system, the humoral system. And Galen, the Greek physician living in ancient Rome, who created this humoral system. Black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. Right, so they had this idea of these different personality types that actually correspond fairly well to what happens when you cross stability and plasticity and consider the four different quadrants. So, like these patterns are there to be observed, and hopefully our ways of describing them become more empirically rigorous and accurate over the centuries.
There's a certain face validity to that in terms of if these are the highest level control parameters that you should expect in some ways the greatest agreement as in attempts at characterizing people's differences and the
right. That's a really
variation.
I had never thought about it in exactly that way, but that is so. The way that the Big Five was discovered goes back to something that's called the lexical tradition, in which people take adjectives that describe people out of the dictionary and then use those and then people rate themselves on those adjectives, and then you do the factor analysis. And the beauty of that method is that you have a relatively unbiased, or at least not biased by the ideas of the experimenter, selection of descriptors and items to start with. And that's been done in languages now all over the world. It's probably been done in, oh God, I know it must be closing in on at least 2 or 3 dozen languages at this point. And the big five.
It seems like a reasonable method to me. Like, people are going to talk about what's important.
Yeah. And there may be some biases there because, of course, we use language for social communication. Like, social traits are the things we talk about the most, social behaviors. So extraversion and agreeableness are always the 2 largest factors in lexical research. And that's probably because those are the ones that describe overt social behavior. So that's what we have the most words for. So, there can still be some biases in the lexicon. So it's not like a perfect gold standard oracle to tell us about the nature of personality, but it's still pretty good because it's got this collection of terms that, it's not like one scientist sat down and thought them up, or even one group of scientists. But okay, so the thing is that, like, the 5-factor solution, the Big Five, that appears in some languages. The 6-factor solution actually appears in a slightly larger number of languages. That's why some people prefer it to the Big Five. But a 2-factor solution is the one that is most replicable across all languages. And those 2 factors describe something that's been described as dynamism and social propriety or social self-control. And you can see, like, that it has a little bit more of a social flavor, which is in keeping with this kind of general bias towards social description, but is very much equivalent to stability and plasticity. Right? It's like your ability to regulate yourself in ways that are appropriate and maintain harmony, or your ability to be dynamic and flexible and impressive and talented. Those appear as the most replicable solution across all languages, which, if those are really reflections of these 2 basic underlying control parameters, that would be sensible.
More, it resembles on the surface, it's resembling more like Digman's interpretation. But if we're like, but
I mean, now all those interpretations are similar, right? Like, so another proposed set of labels, like, there was a guy named Olson who proposed self-control and engagement should be the labels for the meta traits, right? So you've got self-control, social propriety, stability. You've got plasticity, engagement, dynamism. They're all describing these very recognizable, there's a prototypical center to those categories, basically.
Self-control versus engagement. Who used those terms for?
Olson, I think, was back in, 2005, so pretty early on. And I think it was just a theoretical paper, but it was sort of proposing those as ways to think about what these higher order factors mean. And they're good labels, right? They actually describe well what you see as correlates of those things and what goes into the description. Like, people who are low in stability are low in self-control. They get into, the same kinds of trouble over and over again, and they get angry and have tantrums and get upset and can't control the outward expression of their negative emotion. And, their sleep is dysregulated and they take stupid risks. And so, yeah, self-control is a good label. And for engagement, like, people who are high in plasticity, they they perform things and go to performances and engage in public things and engage in interpersonal things and come up with new ideas so it has this very engaged quality, and engage in social life, engage in the world, engage in ideas. So yeah, self-control and engagement, perfectly good labels.
But more fundamentally, though, we're dealing with the challenge facing any complex adaptive system of,
right. Which is part of why I like stability, plasticity, and Grossberg's stability plasticity dilemma, right?
Do you find harmony with what's happening, or do you try to seek out the new?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is it's not even just you find harmony with what's
or
happening
with what you're
because it can
doing.
be, can you preserve harmony with what's happening, right? Because if you're a very stable person, you can go out into a new situation and hold it together, and things like could distract you, and you're able to say, okay, no, I know I can figure out what to pay attention to, what not to pay attention to. I can deal with the disruptions. The stressors are not going to have me spiral out of control. It's like my boundaries and my functional properties remain intact even while I'm shifting and changing. That
Jazz also involves harmony.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. And you can think. I imagine these sort of like blobs moving around, right? And like there's a stable and plastic blob that coheres even while it's changing shape, right?
And we call this a person.
Right. But then there's a stable and rigid blob, and that when it runs into pressures that force it to change shape, it breaks apart. So it's stable for now. It's not going to spontaneously break apart, but when it hits, when it hits the right pressures, rather than flexing, it will just break. So that's high stability, low plasticity. Then you've got, high plasticity, low stability. It's just sort of changing all the time and kind of breaking off, breaking apart. That's dangerous. And then, low stability and low plasticity is just like sits there and then spontaneously disintegrates. um, that's so depression is, if you suffer from severe debilitating depression, you basically have low stability and low plasticity because you can't find the energy or the capacity to try to improve matters, but also just sitting there isn't working either. So you're also miserable and disintegrated
Like
while you're
a
just sitting
pile
there.
of sand or something. And I guess that makes some sense for like connections between depression and sickness behavior in terms of like if you're actually either or models of depression based on like monitoring your social status and like so like if either you are indeed sick or you're at the outskirts of the group is like you're not taken up to it, you're in a very vulnerable position. Like
Yeah,
you're not, you know.
right. So yeah, on the adaptive function of depression, right? Because I was talking about, like a kind of clinical level depression where we say somebody has a serious illness that we might want to intervene. But of course, depression's a normal phenomenon. Things go wrong. You have to abandon your hopes, basically. Uh, Maybe that's because a loved one dies, and so you abandon your kind of hopes that the world will contain them. But whatever it is, right, you have this period where you have to come up with a new set of desires for how the world should be. And in that time, it makes sense that you're not exploring, you're not actively pursuing things, and you don't want to put yourself at risk by exploring while you're also unstable. So there is like an adaptive reason to be in that quadrant of low stability, low plasticity. It's like
I want
hunker down and heal, rather than going out and getting yourself into trouble.
your description of it in terms of physical blobs makes me want to like apply this to individual cells and like different patterns, maybe of even like gene regulation in response to different circumstances. Like a bacteria going into like a sporulated form is now
Hmm.
in the high stability, low plasticity regime.
Right.
But then there's like so then let's say that the bacteria is about to, I don't know, maybe reproduce or something like this. And so you're about to do fission. So then now you're in like, you actually want the blobs to be able to go, so something like that. But then there's so the high stability, high plasticity regime, it's going, it's following those different chemotaxis, getting its thing, moving in and out of just like a normal good bacterium. And then I guess like the low of each is what would that look?
Low of both.
Yeah, low of both for like a individual cell. Like is that just
Well, right. It's probably gonna croak.
yeah.
But
It
okay,
either hasn't like, yeah, it's either like
right.
just born or it's on its way out. Like one of
Let me
those
go
two.
back to my blobs though, okay, just for
Yeah.
a second, because I don't know what it looks like in a bacterium, but it just made me think of something when we're talking about the function of depression. So, like, if you're unstable, you're likely to break apart at any moment. If you're unstable in plastic, you're sort of changing around, you're out there. When you break apart, you're going to lose the pieces, right? It's not going to be able to recohere. But if you are low in stability and low in plasticity, you're just sort of in one place, not changing shape. Things break apart, but they're still close enough together that maybe they can knit themselves back together and sort of heal up again. I mean, obviously, at a micro level, there are obviously plastic processes going on if you are recovering from depression, developing a new set of sort of values or goals or whatever it is.
It kind of sounds like convalescing, though. Like you're like when you're sick,
exactly.
That's actually the process of healing.
Yeah, and you don't want to be like running around and expending a lot of energy at that time, or you won't have enough just for the basic process of restabilizing.
It's these micro adjustments, like the tissue, like then that's in fact like why like a good amount of like healing takes place when we're asleep.
Right.
And like your body will fall apart unless you have that period of like.
And you know what's interesting? So we've got slow wave sleep is low stability, low plasticity, and REM sleep is slow wave sleep would be high stability, low plasticity. REM sleep would be definitely high plasticity, and dopamine seems to be elevated during REM sleep, and serotonin is way low. So I guess REM sleep is like you go into a low stability, high plasticity state, but you're in a high stability state physically because you're not moving, you're in a safe place. Right, so you've got high stability physically, and that allows you to kind of like destabilize mental representations and explore them so that you can build more elaborated representations and make distant connections that you wouldn't necessarily make while you were awake, where you can't afford to be quite as unstable or quite as exploratory. There's this research showing that you can experimentally manipulate whether people have REM sleep or not, and it actually influences their ability to solve creative problems and solve insight problems. So like the whole sleep on it thing is real.
You're making me think of this like as a universality class, and like what they'd say like in physics, like across like a broad range of systems, the same underlying formal structure. So like I'm wondering whether the extent we could look for cross-domain metrics that could potentially tell us where we are among these quadrants, like something like fractal dimension and something else, like regardless of like what we're looking at, whether it's like the EEG when someone's sleeping, or we're looking at, I don't know which we want to do for us, like an individual cell, but like the idea is like there's some sort of like essential variables that if you track them, that one or two dimensions might tell you where you are.
Yeah, well, I mean, if we boil it down to one dimension, then we're basically looking at entropy, right? And so there are various ways to measure the entropy of different systems. You can do it with EEG, but something that I think would be really interesting would be to figure out like how do you differentiate between stability and plasticity in that kind of a measurement context. Can you are there different kinds of entropy? Are there different how would you pull those two things apart?
At one point I was wondering whether you could use I don't think this works, but like something like an entropy measure and an integrated information measure, but something like the ability to, I don't think integrated information would be it, but something of the ability of a system to feed back onto itself in a way that self-reinforces. Like, so it's like the system's autopoietic character, but maybe not even, that might be asking for too much, but just the ability to which a system self-reinforces. So like, what would that look like? Like, what's like a good metric of that?
Yeah. Well, okay. So how about this? So like entropy is basically, we know that complex adaptive systems evolve to be at near the edge of chaos, right? The boundary between order and chaos. And that's where maximal computation, right? Yeah. That's where maximal computation is possible. That's where any computation is possible. So I wonder if you could think of like stability, your basic levels of entropy are basically your stability. Like, are you in the ordered regime? Are you in the chaotic regime? And people have their tendencies to be a little bit more one way or a little bit more in the other. Too far in either direction is trouble. But if you are, so that essentially provides the capacity or the possibility for computation. But then plasticity should basically be like how much computation you're actually doing. So it's like the basic entropy should be stability.
Use that
And
as a
then,
stability measure.
yeah, and then plasticity should be basically like how much computation you're doing, and whether that would be like relative to where you are. I don't know, but on the other dimension. But at any rate, it suggests like what's some kind of universal metric, or at least brain metric, for the amount of computation that's going on.
I think I might actually be flipping it. So in terms of like, actually, instead of integrated information being related to stability, part of what makes it an interesting measure is it tends to be optimized as a complexity measure in this inter-regime. And you're looking at, for instance, the ability of the present configuration to basically constrain the combinatorics of past and future states. And so like there's certain like more sparsely connected, but not like this adaptive capacity within limits. Integrated information might be closer to the mark. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so we know, right? That's why you don't want to be too stable or too unstable, because you want to be on that boundary, or in that boundary zone. But the fact that you're in the boundary zone then doesn't necessarily guarantee exactly what you're doing with the capacities that being there gives you. Right? So being in that zone gives you maximal computational capacity, but then how much computation are you actually doing? And maybe that's plasticity. Anyway, that's probably a good place to leave it, because I know you have to go, right?
I do, yeah. So I'm happy about this for our first conversation. Keep it going.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
We can do it again sometime in the new year.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Talk to you later.